This is the Living Vertizontal podcast, brought to you by The Church at Riverstone, a fellowship of the Church of the Nazarene in Madera, California. Today's episode focuses on Jesus' feeding of the 4,000, found in Matthew 15, 29 to 39. Together, we will be discussing how Jesus takes our desire for Him and all that we have to offer and makes it enough.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nick.
I'm Natasha.
I'm Brittany.
And I'm Derek.
And we are the Living Vertizontal podcast. Back with you. New year. Same us.
New year, new you.
Hopefully transformed us.
All right.
Transforming us.
New year, transforming us. Just as a quick reminder, last week we talked about the faith of the Canaanite woman, and the really cool thing about that passage was how it brought us into face to face with the reality that God is with us, which was so appropriate for Christmas having been last week, and the reality that at Christmas Christ came and God was with us. Emmanuel was there, and so this week we're continuing on in the story. Keep that Canaanite story in your mind, though. And we're going to continue on into Jesus feeding of the 4,000. So this is going to be another food miracle in Matthew that we read about. And that is in Matthew 15, verse 29 through 39. And we're going to have Derek read that for us today. So Derek, would you take that away?
Matthew 15:29. Jesus left there and went along the Sea of Galilee. Then he went up on a mountainside and sat down. Great crowds came to him, bringing the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others, and laid them at his feet, and he healed them. The people were amazed when they saw the mute speaking, the crippled made well, the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they praised the God of Israel. Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. I do not want to send them away hungry, or they may collapse on the way. His disciples answered, Where could we get enough bread in this remote place to feed such a crowd? How many loaves do you have? Jesus asked. 7, they replied, and a few small fish. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. Then he took the 7 loaves and the fish, and when he had given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples, and they in turn to the people, and they all ate and were satisfied. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was 4,000 men, besides women and children. After Jesus had sent the crowd away, he got into the boat and went to the vicinity of Magadan.
All right, so that's our passage for us today. Let's just dive right in. What are you guys seeing? What's popping out to you?
So I think one of the things that sticks out initially is where Jesus is and where he is moving toward. He's along the Sea of Galilee, and so this region would have been a region that was a Gentile region of the area. And so I think it's important to know that as we already know, that his gospel isn't just for the Jews, but it's also for the Gentiles. And I think it sets us up for what we will see later in Matthew or at the end of Matthew. And so, I think that's one really important thing that we can take from this, that God's gospel, as we've talked about before, is not just for some, but it's for all.
Right.
In that conversation, as we were reading this time, it talks about how the Jesus takes the bread and the fish, but particularly I guess the bread jumped out at me because it's later we know this is symbolic of Jesus's body, and he takes the bread and he gives thanks, much like what we will see later paralleled in the Last Supper. He gives thanks and gives it to his disciples to be distributed to the crowd. And then after that, so Jesus' broken body, if you can follow this analogy, Jesus' broken body is distributed to the whole crowd. And then you have these 7 basketfuls left over. So here, in following up, Derek, with what you had said about how this Jesus, he's for everybody. And he's beginning to really teach that and ingrain that, and not to worry, because there's enough Jesus to go around for Gentiles and Jews alike.
And then some.
Mm-hmm.
It's good.
And in that, like, we would see, like, the disciples were Jews among Gentiles. Jesus is a Jew among Gentiles. And so they didn't see them, although they were outsiders, because of what Jesus had lived before them. They weren't treating them as outsiders. They were treating them as others who just needed what he could offer. And even the Gentiles didn't view Jesus as a Jew. They viewed him for who he was, not for his nationality. And so I think when we get to that place of desperation, like, I would imagine many of the people who were coming before him who were lame and blind, and I imagine that they were desperate. And so there's something to that, being desperate. It doesn't, like, it removes all obstacles. Desperation removes anything that would typically hinder us from being in the presence of someone else.
I think the other thing that grabbed my attention at the beginning of this passage, in addition to this, like, reality that of where he's traveling and how it's in Gentile territory, was the fact that Jesus, the second half of verse 29 said, "Then he went up on a mountainside and sat down." And when I read that, I immediately, like, my mind went back to the Sermon on the Mount, where, like, that's the initiation of that teaching, is he goes up on the mountainside and he sits down. And in that time frame, kind of like a historical context, like a teacher, when a teacher was ready to teach and was going to begin teaching, the position, the posture that was assumed was that of sitting down. Today, when a teacher is ready to teach, they stand up. And that's when the class knows, okay, class is ready to begin, because teacher is now standing up in the front of the class. That's not so in this situation. Him standing would have not indicated much, but as soon as he sat down, it's like, okay, now it's time for us to hone in on what is going on here. And I think the reason why that really caught me, as I thought about it some more, was I've always read this passage as just a straight, like, miracle passage where, like, people are being healed and then people are being fed with food. But the opening of this passage, to me, seems to indicate that it wasn't just, like, miraculous acts that were occurring at this place. Like, Jesus was sitting down to teach and people were coming to hear what he had to say. Yes, they knew what he could do, and so they brought their sick to him, but they were also bringing themselves to him and subjecting themselves to what he had to say. And also, I mean, it's only 10 verses, 11 verses that of space that is taken up, and yet this is a 3-day period. Like, this is a pretty intense time. I guess if I were to think about it today, maybe like a revival of sorts that was going on. So that was what grabbed me, is just how much more there is going on in this passage than I think I ever initially thought.
And I think teaching doesn't always have to come with words. And maybe that's why there isn't really any statement about Jesus saying anything, because maybe the teaching that he was wanting to accomplish came through his response to the other. And so, I mean, because when we talked about this in our discussion at our tables on Sunday, that was, the teaching aspect came up. But as you talk, that's something that came to my mind, that maybe the teaching was just through the example that he was giving, and not necessarily what he was saying.
So that's kind of reminiscent to me of last week, and maybe like a continued playing out of part of the conversation that we had last week about how like Jesus in the exchange with the Canaanite woman didn't necessarily teach through the words that he said, because if we're honest, the words that are on the page don't really sound like the Jesus that we know throughout the rest of Matthew. But the action that was playing out in the process of it was a lesson that said, look, what I have to offer, it's for everybody. And ultimately, you're right. Ultimately, woman, your faith merits my healing of your daughter. And so this really is for everybody. And so just like last week, he didn't necessarily teach that lesson by saying words. He taught it through his actions. He's continuing that lesson where he says, like, the salvation that I offer, the wholeness that I bring is not just the wholeness that is for the people of Israel, but it is also for these Gentiles here that he's healing and feeding and caring for.
I think the next thing that really sticks out to me is verse 32, where he says, I have compassion for these people. They've already been here 3 days and have had nothing to eat. And so now he's kind of putting words behind the teaching. And I would say it's more specific to the disciples, because that's who is he's addressing. But he brings in this compassion aspect, but he's also like preparing to go into this like idea of showing them or teaching them that even though people aren't necessarily asking for something, like he knows what they need before they even ask. And so he's not just looking to meet the physical needs, like the healing that they need, but also to sustain them with food. And they haven't even asked it, but they've been so desperate for 3 days, like food has not been on their mind. And so there's this idea of what his compassion looks like. He knows what we need before we even ask.
I wonder about the 3 days and if there's any parallel. I don't know if that has any meaning necessarily, knowing like that it was 3 days until he would rise from the grave. Because it seems like there's so much he's beginning to teach about the cross, just in these different elements that we've been reading about over the last couple of weeks. And then the Great Commission he's about to send everybody on. And so I don't know.
And
I
the
wonder,
breaking of bread that you brought up previously.
Yeah. So I just wonder if there's any, I don't know, maybe a parallel between those 3 days, of them being there waiting, waiting to see Jesus, like waiting to be fed by Jesus, essentially, unknowingly so, right? Like not even recognizing necessarily their need for that, but Jesus seeing their need. I don't know. And then I guess just after that, where Jesus says, I do not want to send them away hungry. I know these words in context refer to this crowd who have a long journey ahead of them as they go back. But I imagine that's kind of what it's like every time we come to spend time with Jesus. I feel like I can hear him saying that. I don't want to send you away hungry. Come to me. Come be fed. I want to feed you. I want to provide for you and meet your spiritual needs every time we meet.
He wants to satisfy.
Yeah, so I see that promise tucked in there in his words.
So when I look at this, I see a lot of parallels to the feeding of the 5,000 that happened in chapter 14. And, Derek, you brought up that, this was Gentile territory. It seems that Jesus is doing, Jesus fed the 5,000 in Jewish territory, and goes and feeds 4,000 in the Gentile territory, and he does it the same exact way. He finds out what is available, and he has everybody sit on the ground. He takes the food, and he thanks the Lord for it, and he breaks them into pieces, and he gives them give them to the disciples, who distributes them to the crowd. It reminded me when we were talking about this on Sunday, that he's the same. He's the same for the Jew. He's the same for the Gentile. He's the same today as he was yesterday.
You saying that specifically when you said like the continuity that exists and the parallels between the other story of the feeding, there's something that in my mind has been, that I've kind of been throwing around, and I think it's a very similar conversation, because what he said, let's see, verse 30 and 31, essentially that the people were amazed when they saw the mute speaking, the crippled made well, the lame walking, and the blind seeing. That again is this like bringing forward, not necessarily a quoting or anything, but a bringing forward of the conversation from Isaiah 35, which was referenced in Matthew 11 when the disciples of John the Baptist came to Jesus and asked if he was the Messiah. Like they didn't say, "Are you the Messiah?" They said, where is it? Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else? And Jesus' reply to them is, go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and good news is proclaimed to the poor. And this was like Jesus, without saying, yeah, I'm the one to come, he points to the proof of who he is. That all around him, people are being healed, and the kingdom of heaven is being ushered in. And this, the context of this answer was other Jews. And now we're fast forwarding and we're in this territory of the Gentiles, and he is giving, we are seeing the same answer. And so like you just said, how he is, Jesus is the same, whether it's the Jew or the Gentile, like he is the same. He is the same Messiah that was sent for the Jews is also sent for the Gentiles, because the same kingdom that is breaking in front of the Jews and amongst the Jews is also breaking in front of the Gentiles and amongst the Gentiles. And that's exciting.
And I wonder if it would be too far to like kind of bring this into today, if it would be too far to say that, you know, Jesus, just as he came for the Jews and the Gentiles, he came for the saints and the sinners. And just keeping that in perspective and remembering that it's not a particular class that Jesus is coming back for. Right? Like we know as the church, we're supposed to be prepared, but he wants to restore all of creation.
Yeah. It's his will that none should perish. None is a pretty strong word, I feel like. And yet, this compassion that Jesus has is attractive. The love that he has, the way that he lives is attractive. So then it makes me ask the question, like, the compassion that I have, or the way that I live, or the love that I have, is it equally, not that I'm Jesus, but is he being displayed in me enough that it's attractive to the people around me? Because ultimately, like, that is the objective as a believer, as a Christian, as someone who says that I am going to live like Jesus. Then I should, like, we've had this discussion a few weeks ago about this idea of being like the way that Jesus lived is attractive. And I think that compassion that he displayed, or that he talked to the disciples about, is maybe that is like in the first part, he lived that out. Like it was done through his action. In like the second half of this, I feel like it's more like addressing the church. Like this is what compassion should look like, because the disciples are the church at this time. And so like, this is what compassion should look like. We know what people who don't know know Christ's need. And so what are we doing to like make sure that it has hands and feet, that it's actually being lived out?
We don't send them away hungry.
Right? We're making sure that they leave satisfied. And then there's still extra to collect, like when everyone's satisfied. It kind of reminds me of like the manna, like there was enough, like they could have kept going out and collecting and collecting and collecting, but what was going to happen? Like it was going to be useless, right? It was going to be useless. But like he gives us what we need, and anything else, like we don't have to keep like running back trying to get extra and extra and extra, because he supplies what we need to be satisfied.
Holding this in the context of being the people, Derek, like you said, who are called to have this Jesus-like compassion for those who are lost and to declare this good news. I think sometimes it can become exhausting, or you feel like you don't have the time, or you can make 1,000 excuses depending on probably even your personality type, or your schedule or whatever. But what you said when you said, he satisfies and he will provide enough, and then there will still be some left over. So whether it's time that's being prohibitive, whether it's me thinking my personality is too quiet, I'm not bold enough, like I can't talk to other people, I'm going to get peopled out, whatever that is, he will be sufficient and he will provide enough.
Right.
And there will still be excess at the end of it. So I feel like that's empowering to know that he hasn't sent us on a mission without promising that he will equip and provide for whatever we need, even if we don't see it.
Yeah, he's making provision before we even ask for it, because the people hadn't asked for food. But that's what a good God does. Like he sees our need and he's like, I'm going to meet the need. If we're where we need to be, he always meets the need.
I think kind of in the vein of this conversation, in looking at the story. So, Jesus asks the disciples after they say, where are we going to get enough food to feed these people? He says, how many loaves do you have? 7, they replied, and a few small fish. While there is a miracle that takes place here, right? Because 7 loaves and a few small fish do not feed 4,000 people ever, right? Without a miracle taking place. The miracle doesn't happen without the sacrificial giving of what they did have. Like the disciples, Jesus asked the question, what do you have? And they said, this is all we have. Here it is. 7 pieces of bread and 2 small fish, or a few fish. That's all we have. And so it's like Jesus takes the sacrifice of his disciples and he makes it sufficient for the task at hand. And that, for me, it gives me hope. And I think it gives all of us hope as people in bringing it into today, because Jesus has called us to do something. I mean, Matthew 28:19, pretty clear. Go and make disciples in all the world, right? The call throughout, let's see, 1 Peter, be holy as I am holy. You got 1 John to live as Jesus lived. This conversation, like there are some pretty impressive things that are put into our hands, where like there's a calling on our lives as people who want to follow after Jesus. And the reality is we don't have to acquire a skill set on our own to meet that calling. We simply have to say, okay, Jesus, I hear what you're asking for. This is everything I have.
Make it enough.
And then Jesus takes care of the rest. And I think too often we allow ourselves to, well, we almost paralyze ourselves because we convince ourselves that we can't do something, right? Like I'm not a gifted speaker. I'm an introvert. I don't have enough time. Like whatever it is, like you can, the gamut of excuses is vast.
I can't disciple somebody.
I can't disciple somebody. But our role in the work of God, in the work of what Jesus wants to accomplish in this story and in the story of our lives, our role is simply a role of full surrender where we offer everything that we have, and then he takes care of the rest. Now, I don't have to say I can't disciple. Well, the truth is, you're right. We can't. I can't disciple somebody. But when I offer everything that I am, my time, my nuances that I may have, the weird quirks about me, he's going to take that and he's going to put me in a situation with somebody that all of a sudden I can disciple because he is working in me and through me, right? I'm not the miracle, but I'm part of it.
So I wonder when we don't take those things, like we don't sacrificially give. Maybe this is a bad parallel, but I think of Ananias and Sapphira. And like, I'm not trying to condemn anyone, but when we don't take everything and leave our hands open and say like, here's my time or here's my whatever, fill in the blank. Are we doing the same thing? Like, it's essentially like we go to Jesus with our two hands, but one's like held closed. Like we don't, you can't have what's in you. Like you can have this side, you can have my left hand, but you can't have what's in my right hand. And maybe that's not a fair like parallel, but I could see where that could be similar, where we're not willing to give everything.
Or we're afraid to do so.
Yeah.
Well, we stop at that first question, or, Jesus says that, it talks about them being hungry and he doesn't want to send them away. And the disciples replied, well, where are we going to get food around here? There's not enough here. And when we do that, we kind of stop there. Like, we don't have enough. We don't have what it takes.
We tried.
Yep. Sorry. Like somebody else is going to have to come and take care of that. But Jesus points out, hey, you've got something. You just have to give it up. You just have to let me do something with that. And I think a lot of times it's hard for us to have that faith, even though we've probably seen it before because they saw it before. They saw it in the chapter before. Like he took this, he did something miraculous with it. But, this time, maybe he won't. Maybe, what we have, we just have 7 loaves. Like that's not going to be enough. But, Jesus, just tells them, hey, this is what you have and this is watch what I can do with it.
He makes whatever offering we give enough.
And I think, not to put a caveat on that, but I do think it's important that we recognize it. It's not that the disciples had 25 loaves of bread and they gave 7. They said, we have 7 loaves. This is what we have. And so, yes, I think that Jesus can absolutely take whatever we offer and make it enough. But I think it comes into that conversation of like, where is your heart in the giving? Mm-hmm. Like, are we giving, expecting a miracle because we don't want to give everything because we got to keep some for ourselves? And it's like, okay, Jesus, you're going to have to do something because this is all I can afford to give you. And so you need to do something with that because I need to make sure I have this for myself.
Well, and I think that's where Derek was going with the Ananias and Sapphira in Acts in the early church when they had sold their property. And then they decided, we're going to say this is everything we got. And we're going to keep this back because we need something for us. We can't just give everything up.
And when we do that, we're really living in deceit. Like, and who are you deceiving? Like, okay, if I deceive you, okay, like that's a person. But when you do that to Jesus, you're just trying to deceive the Creator who knows your every thought. Right. And so, like, it's easy. It could be easy to look and say, well, wow, that's great faith. Like, I'm so glad that they were able to do that. But, it's an opportunity to truly, like, put your faith in the hands of the one who can make the giving enough. Mm-hmm. And when you give it all, like, he does unbelievable things. And I don't mean fish or money, whatever the all is that he's asking for, because it might be fish today, it might be money tomorrow, it might be fill in the blank. But when you give all, like, he can do incredible things. And I mean, we've all been privileged to see what God does when we say, I'm giving all. Mm-hmm. Like, you look back in amazement, like, how could that have possibly ever happened? Because you were willing to say, well, this is what I have, Jesus. Like, if you can use it, like, use it.
Right.
And then he does amazing things.
And I think the thing is, when we give it all, not only is the miracle what God does with what we give, but the miracle is how he still takes care of us in the midst of our surrender of everything. Like, I look at this particular story again, right? We know that he had, 12 disciples that were regularly with him. It doesn't give a list of the names of those that were with him, but we could assume it's the 12. And he asks them what they have, and they say, we have 7 loaves and a few small fish. Last time I checked, 7 loaves and a few small fish is not enough for 12 men to eat and feel satisfied. Just throwing it out there. And yet they offered it up, and they were part of that group that was satisfied as a result of their surrender, Jesus' miracle. They were also provided for in the midst of their sacrifice. And so it's almost like our willingness to give sacrificially in whatever arena that giving might take place in, is an indication or a reflection of our faith and trust that God is God, and he's going to not just take care of those on the other side of the gift, but the one on this side of the gift who is sacrificially giving.
I think maybe one of the other things that we could talk about in this is pertains more to the crowds. And so jumps back a little bit to verse 32. And so we have these crowds, and they're there, and I imagine as they're teaching, or as Jesus is teaching, and they're watching these miracles, they know what supplies they brought with them. Undoubtedly, they brought supplies with them for this journey. They knew it would be maybe a bit of time, but their supplies are running thin. But yet they stay. They continue to stay and continue to stay and continue to stay until Jesus sees it as, well, they don't have enough. They must be super hungry, so much so that he's concerned that they'll collapse on their way home. And so it's like Jesus allows them to kind of get to this place of them being at the end and choosing to stay, even knowing they have no backup plan, right? Like, they've got to make this journey home, but that's it. That's all there is. And I think there's a lot we can probably take from that for us today.
Desire makes you do crazy things. That's I think of, like, anytime we plan a trip, like, we're making sure we got, like, everything we need for every day, and you go somewhere with the expectation that you're going to be there like an afternoon, and then 3 days later you're like, oh, I'm still here. But desire makes you do crazy things.
Oh, to have that desire for Jesus, that you would sit there at his feet so long that you put your own life in jeopardy, that you put your own journey home at risk.
As you guys are saying that, all I can think is, the Beatitudes and Jesus saying, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." And this is a perfect example of a people who were hungering and thirsting for righteousness because they were there for Jesus. And I'm pretty sure if we were to look up righteousness in like a Bible dictionary, obviously, you would see Jesus' name right there. And they were just hungering and thirsting for him. And I think this is so probably intentionally poetic and beautiful that we have this like feeding story in the midst of people who are clearly hungering and thirsting for him, and they're not concerned with their own physical hunger or thirst because they see their need for him and they want him so badly.
Well, when you want him that badly, like we sang on Sunday, nothing else will do. Like you just want Jesus, and everything else like grows strangely dim. Because as I already stated, that desire will make you do crazy things. Crazy things that, well, they will seem crazy. Maybe I should say it like that. It will do things that will make others scratch their head. I mean, I think that's a life. For me, I almost feel like that's an indicator of like knowing that you're doing Jesus's will. It's like how crazy has your life been? Like for me, that feels like an indicator. Like I've seen people who've done things that will make you scratch your head, and yet you see Jesus in the middle of them because desire does that. And when nothing else will do, that's what you do. And on the flip side, when you're someone who has already made that decision and living in that desire, you know, the disciples lived that out of like, I surrender all. Like, this is all I have, and I'm going to surrender it to you. And just see what you can do with it. And you're right. Like, what you said is true. Like, it meets the need of the person, and it also meets the need of the giver. But, I mean, looking at it from a perspective or trying to have, like, the heart of Jesus, like, you are concerned with what you're giving, like, how it meets the needs of others. Like, if I'm sitting there in a crowd of 4,000 men and women and children, and I'm seeing, like, God provide the needs of these people who had nothing, like, I'm thanking Jesus, not because of my gift. Mm-hmm. I'm thanking him because he took what seemed like nothing and fed people with it. And so, like, I think both sides are obviously important, but I mean, it's unbelievable to see what God can do with a little bit. Like, our little is enough in his hands.
I just keep thinking about this idea of desire. And I remember it was like 2 episodes ago, maybe 3, when you, Derek, brought up like addicts and the crazy things that people will do to like get that high or whatever it is that they're addicted to, like to obtain that object of their desire. And it just, I don't know. And then this idea of hungering and thirsting for righteousness. And I guess I'm continuing to be overwhelmed. Like, I think about the place where we live and the people that live here, their desires are elsewhere. Like, they are not the ones that are hungering and thirsting for righteousness.
My question would be, is it that not that they don't desire, or is it that nobody has lived out the desire enough for them to want
maybe
that?
Yeah, probably.
Well, and here we are again faced with this reality that they were encountering Jesus. Like, they got to see him firsthand. We are the Jesus.
Right.
Like, we are what they encounter. We are his hands and feet.
Right.
And so what Jesus are we giving? Be sure to follow the Living Vertizontal podcast to stay current on all our new releases. To learn more about the Church at Riverstone, visit us at thechurchatriverstone.org.